Good morning, everybody. I hope you're doing great wherever you're tuning in from. Let's talk about a number that just came out of Central Command, because it tells you more about the state of this war than almost any strike footage could. 9 commercial vessels redirected, 1 disabled. That's the tally CENTCOM put out as of July 22nd. And behind that clean, clinical sentence is one of the most effective pressure campaigns of the entire conflict. One that doesn't involve a single explosion you'd see on the news, but is quietly strangling the regime's ability to move anything in or out of its own coastline. This is the naval blockade. And if you've been following the bigger strike stories, the fighter jets, the bombers, the command centers going up in flames, it's easy to miss this piece entirely, because it doesn't look like war in the traditional sense. There's no fireball. There's no dramatic night vision footage of a building collapsing. What you get instead is a warship sitting quietly in the Arabian Sea, a destroyer's crew watching radar screens, and one by one, ships either turning around on their own or getting a very direct message that they're not getting through. And today, we're going to break down exactly how this blockade works, what happened to the one ship that didn't turn around, why 9 others did, what Iran's own military just admitted about tankers turning back after an explosion on their side of the water, how this current campaign stacks up against the first blockade earlier this year, and what this economic squeeze actually means for a regime that is already bleeding money it doesn't have. We'll get into the mechanics of how a modern naval blockade actually operates, the specific ship that got disabled and why, the honest picture of how much oil is still finding a way through despite all of this, and then we'll swing into the global roundup before closing out with the strategic picture. So let's get into it. Let's start with how we got here, because the blockade itself has a bit of a history worth understanding. Back in April, the United States first imposed a naval blockade on Iranian ports, and it ran for roughly 2 months before a ceasefire and a memorandum of understanding between Washington and Tehran led to it being lifted in mid-June. During that first stretch, CENTCOM's own numbers were staggering. Over 140 compliant vessels redirected, 9 ships disabled outright, while more than 50 vessels carrying humanitarian aid were allowed to pass through untouched. That's worth sitting with for a second. Because it tells you the blockade was never a blunt instrument. It was selective. Ships that complied, that turned around when warned, were left alone. Ships that tried to run it were not. Then came the collapse. The memorandum of understanding between the US and Iran, the one signed back on June 17th, started falling apart when Iran began targeting commercial vessels using a specific route through the Strait of Hormuz, the one that hugs the Omani coastline, a route that the US Navy had effectively been protecting under the terms of that agreement. Multiple tankers were hit in that corridor over a span of days. At least 5 commercial vessels attacked since the memorandum was signed, with 3 of them struck in a single 48-hour window that the International Maritime Organization called the worst single day for tanker attacks in the Strait since late April. That was the moment the temporary peace effectively ended. The United States revoked the sanctions waiver it had issued that allowed limited Iranian oil sales, and shortly after, the blockade was reimposed, this time starting at 4 p.m. Eastern on July 14th. And almost immediately, you could see the deterrent effect kick in. Within the first 17 hours of the blockade being reinstated, CENTCOM reported it had already redirected 2 commercial vessels attempting to enter Iranian waters. 2 ships that had been heading toward Iranian ports simply changed course rather than test the blockade. And then, the very next day, July 15th, came the moment that set the tone for everything that followed. The Curacao-flagged oil tanker MT Belma, sailing in ballast, meaning empty, without cargo, was making its way toward Karg Island, which is Iran's primary crude oil export terminal. CENTCOM says the Belma ignored multiple warnings, and when it kept going, a U.S. aircraft fired Hellfire missiles directly into the ship's smokestack. Now, I want you to think about the precision of that for a second, because this is where the professionalism of this operation really shows. They didn't sink the ship, they didn't hit the hull, they didn't hit the cargo tanks, because even though this vessel was empty at the time, striking the tanks on a fully loaded tanker could cause an environmental disaster in some of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. Instead, the strike targeted the smokestack, which houses the engine's exhaust and critical propulsion systems. The goal wasn't destruction, it was disablement. Take away the ship's ability to move under its own power without creating a spill, without killing anyone aboard, without turning a law enforcement action into a humanitarian catastrophe. CENTCOM's statement afterward was almost understated in how clinical it was. The ship is no longer transiting to Iran. That's it. No fireworks, no dramatic music, just a fact. And that's the entire philosophy behind how this blockade is being enforced. Overwhelming precision instead of overwhelming force. From there, the numbers just kept climbing, and honestly, they read almost like a scoreboard if you track them day by day. By July 18th, CENTCOM said it had redirected 5 commercial vessels and disabled 1. By July 19th, that number moved to 6 redirected, 1 disabled. By July 20th, 7 redirected, 1 disabled. And now, as of July 22nd, the number sits at 9 commercial vessels redirected. And that same one ship, the Belma, still the only vessel that's actually been disabled by force. Everything else has been voluntary compliance under pressure, ships that got the warning and decided the smart move was to simply turn around. That distinction matters more than people realize, because it tells you something important about how effective the threat itself has become. You don't need to disable 9 ships to redirect 9 ships. You need to disable 1 ship, publicize it, and let the entire global shipping industry watch the footage. After that, most vessel operators do the math themselves. Insurance premiums for entering the blockade zone become untenable. Captains and shipping companies start rerouting before they ever get close enough for a warning shot to be necessary. That's not weakness. That's a blockade working exactly the way a blockade is supposed to work. The first strike does most of the deterrent work. Everything after that is just the world watching and adjusting. Now let's talk about what's actually enforcing this, because this isn't just one lucky missile shot. There's a real naval presence out there making this happen night after night. We've seen the guided missile destroyer USS John Finn conducting operations to maintain compliance. We've seen the USS Donald Cook transiting the Arabian Sea as part of the same enforcement mission, with an MH-60 Seahawk helicopter flying nearby, providing additional surveillance and response capability. We've seen the USS Michael Murphy's crew working inside the ship's Combat Information Center, monitoring the picture in real time as vessels approach the blockade line. This is a rotating presence of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, some of the most capable surface combatants in the world, each one equipped with the Aegis combat system, radar and sensor networks that can track dozens of contacts simultaneously across hundreds of miles of open water. Here's how the actual enforcement chain works in practice. A commercial vessel approaches the exclusion zone around Iranian waters. Naval assets, whether that's a destroyer, a patrol aircraft, or in some cases an armed unmanned system, identify the vessel, cross-reference it against shipping databases to determine its flag, its cargo manifest, its declared destination. If the vessel's course indicates it's heading toward an Iranian port, warnings go out, first over standard maritime radio channels, sometimes repeated multiple times, giving the vessel every opportunity to alter course voluntarily. The vast majority comply at that stage. That's most of your 9 redirected vessels right there, ships that got the call and made the obvious business decision. But for the small number that don't comply, that keep pushing toward Iranian waters despite repeated warnings, that's when you get what happened to the Belma. A precision strike designed to stop the ship without destroying it or endangering the crew. And I think it's worth pausing here to give credit to just how disciplined that rules of engagement framework actually is. This is not a free fire zone. This is a deliberately calibrated use of force, warning after warning, giving every vessel the chance to comply and only escalating to disabling fire when a ship makes clear it isn't going to. That's a much harder standard to maintain than people give it credit for, especially in a high-tempo environment where you're tracking dozens of vessels simultaneously across an enormous stretch of ocean. Let's talk for a second about the humanitarian exception built into this blockade, because I think it's one of the more underappreciated parts of the whole operation. During the first blockade earlier this year, CENTCOM's own numbers showed more than 50 vessels carrying humanitarian aid were allowed through untouched, even while over 140 other vessels were being redirected and 9 were being disabled. That's a meaningful distinction, and it's worth making clearly, because a blockade that made no exceptions for food, medicine, or aid shipments would be a fundamentally different and far more ethically fraught operation. The fact that this one has consistently carved out space for humanitarian traffic, even in its most aggressive enforcement periods, tells you something about how this campaign has actually been designed. It's targeted at commercial and economic traffic tied to the regime's revenue streams, not at the basic needs of the civilian population caught in the middle of all of this. That distinction also matters for the sailors actually carrying this mission out, because it's worth remembering that every one of these numbers, 9 redirected, 1 disabled, represents real people making real decisions under real pressure, night after night, for months at a time, across a stretch of water that includes some of the busiest and most economically consequential shipping lanes on the entire planet. The crews aboard ships like the John Finn, the Donald Cook, and the Michael Murphy are standing long watches in the Combat Information Center, tracking dozens of contacts simultaneously, trying to correctly identify which approaching vessel is a confused commercial captain who just needs a radio warning, and which one might be something else entirely. That's an enormous amount of judgment being exercised continuously, in real time, by junior sailors and officers who don't get their names attached to a CENTCOM press release, but whose split-second calls are what actually keeps this blockade both effective and remarkably restrained. Whatever you think about the broader conflict, that kind of sustained discipline, night after night, deserves real acknowledgement. Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because while the US Navy has been running this incredibly precise, almost surgical enforcement campaign, Iran has been dealing with a very different kind of maritime chaos, one largely of its own making. Just this week, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed it stopped 3 oil tankers from passing through the Strait of Hormuz. But listen to how they described what actually happened, because this is where their own statement gets uncomfortable for them. According to the Guard's own account, as reported through Iranian state media, 3 tankers attempted to pass through what they called a mine-laid route south of the strait, and after one of them exploded and caught fire, the other 2 turned around and headed back the way they came. Read that again. Iran is publicly admitting in its own official statement that it has mined a shipping route, that a tanker hit one of those mines and caught fire, and that the resulting panic sent 2 more vessels fleeing in the opposite direction. That's not a military victory. That's a regime accidentally revealing that it's laid explosive hazards in international shipping lanes and is now trying to spin an accident into a show of strength. And this fits a much wider pattern we've seen over the past several weeks. Ship tracking data from Bloomberg showed at least 8 vessels attempting to leave the Persian Gulf along the Omani coast, making sharp U-turns within a single 48-hour window. Some getting as far as the tip of the Musandam Peninsula before reversing course entirely. A handful eventually continued their voyage, but only after switching to a different route, one further from Iran's reach. Separately, other tracking data showed empty tankers like the Marie C and the Red Ruby diverting entirely, dropping anchor near Fujairah, rather than risk the strait at all. So, here's the honest comparison, because I think it's the most important part of this whole story. On one side, you have the United States Navy, disabling exactly 1 vessel with surgical precision, avoiding an environmental disaster, publicizing the action clearly, and using that single incident to achieve voluntary compliance from 9 more ships without needing to fire another shot. On the other side, you have Iran, mining its own claimed waters, watching a tanker catch fire, and then trying to frame the resulting panic and mass U-turns as some kind of deterrent to success. One of these approaches is disciplined and effective. The other is chaotic and, frankly, dangerous to the exact commercial shipping industry Iran claims it wants to protect. And global shipping insurers know the difference. That's part of why average daily crossings through the strait have remained a fraction of pre-war levels, even during periods when a ceasefire was technically in effect. Let's talk honestly about what Iran is actually capable of here too, because I don't want to make this sound like their maritime position is completely toothless. It isn't. Iran still has fast attack craft, a substantial mine-laying capability that they've clearly demonstrated they're willing to use even in waters they claim to control, and a track record of harassment tactics against commercial shipping that goes back years. The IRGC Navy has previously seized tankers outright, detained foreign crew members, and used exactly this kind of ambiguity. Is that a mine? Is that an accident? Is that deliberate? As a tool to keep global shipping on edge without ever fully committing to a declaration of open conflict on the water. So even with the blockade squeezing them from one direction, Iran retains the ability to make transiting the strait genuinely dangerous and unpredictable for anyone trying to move through it, regardless of which side of the blockade line they're on. There's another layer to this worth being honest about too, because I don't want to make it sound like Iran's mining campaign is purely incompetent bluster. Mine warfare has historically been one of the most cost-effective tools available to a weaker naval power facing a stronger one. You don't need a battle fleet to make a shipping lane dangerous. You need a relatively small number of relatively cheap explosive devices and the willingness to use them in ambiguous, hard-to-attribute ways. That's precisely what makes Iran's approach in the strait so difficult to fully counter, even for a navy as capable as the United States Navy. You can track ships. He said the blockade is up, and fully, and that nobody gets through, calling it like a steel wall. Now, is that description perfectly accurate? Not entirely, and it's worth being honest about that too. You can track known military vessels. It's far harder to guarantee you found every mine laid across a shipping route that spans dozens of miles of water, especially when the party laying them has every incentive to keep their exact locations deliberately unclear. So the honest picture here is a mixed one. Iran's public messaging around the 3-tanker incident was clumsy and arguably self-defeating, admitting to a mined route while trying to frame the resulting chaos as a win. But the underlying tactic, using mines and ambiguous threats to make an entire shipping corridor feel unsafe regardless of who's actually enforcing order there, is a genuinely effective form of asymmetric pressure, and it's part of why average daily crossings remain well below pre-war levels, even along routes the U.S. Navy is actively protecting. Fear doesn't need to be rational to be effective at suppressing shipping traffic. It just needs to be persistent. But here's the strategic problem that creates for Tehran, and it's a problem entirely of their own making. Every mine they lay, every tanker they threaten, every U-turn they force, adds to the exact narrative the United States once told. That transiting near Iranian claimed waters is chaotic and dangerous, while transiting under U.S. Navy protection along the Omani route is orderly and safe. Iran's own chief negotiator, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, admitted in a late June interview that Iran had been unable to export a single barrel of oil during the earlier blockade period. Not reduced exports, not slowed exports. Zero. And that was before the second round even started. President Trump, in comments before a meeting with Lebanese President Joseph Aoun, put it about as bluntly as you can put it. Ship tracking data does show that some vessels, particularly ones willing to take the Iranian-controlled northern route through the Strait instead of the U.S. Our protected Omani route have continued moving. Roughly 34 commodity vessels a day have been crossing on average in recent weeks, which is a notable increase from the lowest points of the war, but still far below the 60-plus daily crossings the Strait saw before any of this started. So the blockade isn't an absolute perfect steel wall in the literal sense. Some volume is still finding a way through, largely by accepting Iran's dictated route instead of the safer one. But as an economic weapon, as a tool for making Iranian oil exports specifically, the ships headed to or from Iranian ports, functionally impossible to move without massive risk, it's working almost exactly as designed. And that gets to the real reason this story matters more than a lot of the flashier strike footage we've covered before. Iran's economy runs on oil exports. It's the lifeblood of a regime that needs hard currency to fund everything from its military rebuilding efforts to the subsidies that keep its domestic population from getting even more restless than it already is. Every day the blockade holds, every tanker that gets redirected, every vessel that decides the risk isn't worth it and quietly reroutes to Fujairah instead, is a day of lost revenue that regime cannot easily make up elsewhere. You can rebuild a radar site. You can rebuild a command center, eventually, given enough time and enough money. But you can't rebuild months of lost oil revenue after the fact. That money is just gone. And it was money the regime was counting on to fund the very war machine it's trying to use against its neighbors. Let's shift into the global roundup, because there's a broader economic angle here worth understanding, and it connects directly to everything we just discussed. Iraq has reportedly lost more than $40 billion in revenue since the start of the broader Middle East conflict, largely due to a sharp decline in its own oil exports, a decline driven in significant part by the disruption to shipping through the Strait and the broader instability radiating out from the Iran conflict. That's an important reminder that this blockade and the broader chaos in the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just hurt Iran. It ripples outward to every economy that depends on that waterway, including countries that aren't even direct participants in the conflict. When a choke point responsible for a massive share of the world's seaborne oil trade becomes this unpredictable, the effects show up in fuel prices and shipping insurance rates for economies that have absolutely nothing to do with the underlying dispute. There's a market dimension to this worth spending a moment on too, because it's the part of the story that most directly touches people who have never thought twice about the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping insurers, the companies who calculate war risk premiums for vessels transiting contested waters, have continued adjusting their pricing models as this blockade and the parallel mining campaign have played out. When a route becomes unpredictable in the way the Strait currently is, tankers hit on one side, mines on another, a functioning but selective blockade running through the middle of it, insurers respond by raising premiums specifically for that corridor, sometimes dramatically. Those costs get passed down the chain from the shipping company to the oil trader to, eventually, the price at the pump in countries that have no direct stake in this conflict whatsoever. That's the mechanism by which a regional naval standoff becomes a global economic story. And it's worth remembering every time oil prices tick upward without an obvious domestic explanation. There's also been continued instability in the Red Sea corridor running in parallel to all of this, with reports of ongoing attacks on shipping there as well, adding yet another layer of risk for any vessel trying to route around the Gulf entirely by going the long way. So you end up with a genuinely difficult picture for global shipping right now. The traditional route through Hormuz is contested and increasingly mined. The alternative route through the Red Sea has its own separate set of threats. And in the middle of all of it sits a U.S. naval blockade that, whatever else you think about it, is at least operating according to a clear, disciplined, and predictable set of rules, which in this environment might be the single most valuable thing it offers to an already exhausted global shipping industry. Before we get into the strategic analysis, I want to zoom out for a moment and put this blockade in some historical context. Because naval blockades as a tool of coercive pressure aren't new, and understanding how similar campaigns have played out elsewhere actually helps explain why the United States is running this one the way it is. Blockades have been used throughout modern history, specifically because they offer something most other forms of military pressure don't: a way to inflict serious, sustained economic damage on an adversary, while minimizing direct casualties on both sides. A blockade doesn't require troops on the ground. It doesn't require destroying cities or infrastructure. It requires ships, patience, and the discipline to enforce a consistent set of rules over a long period of time, which is exactly the pattern we've watched unfold here. Redirect, 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 and only escalate to disabling force when a vessel makes clear it won't comply. The trade-off, historically, is that blockades are slow. They don't produce the kind of dramatic single-night outcome that a bombing campaign can. Their effectiveness is measured in weeks and months, in cumulative lost revenue and mounting economic strain, rather than in a single decisive strike. That's part of why this story doesn't generate the same kind of explosive footage as a strike package hitting a command center, and it's exactly why it's easy to underestimate how much pressure it's actually applying. A blockade succeeding looks like nothing happening, like ships quietly turning around, like oil that simply never gets loaded. It's an undramatic kind of pressure, but historically, it's also one of the hardest kinds for a besieged regime to actually counter, because there's no single facility to defend, no single strike package to intercept. The pressure is diffuse, constant, and cumulative, and it's applied every single day whether or not a camera happens to be pointed at it. All right, let's move into the strategic analysis, because I think this is where the real significance of a number like 9 redirected, 1 disabled actually becomes clear. Modern blockades don't win wars through a single dramatic moment. They win through attrition, through the slow compounding weight of lost revenue, rerouted trade, and rising insurance costs that eventually make a regime's economic position genuinely untenable. What we're watching right now is exactly that kind of attrition playing out in real time. The United States isn't trying to sink Iran's merchant fleet. It's trying to make the cost of doing business with Iran, or on Iran's behalf, high enough that the market does the work on its own. And based on Ghalibaf's own admission that Iran couldn't move a single barrel during the earlier blockade period, that strategy has already proven it can work, at least when it's actually enforced consistently. What makes this current phase particularly interesting is the contrast in discipline between the two sides. The U.S. Navy's approach, warn repeatedly, disable with precision only when necessary, avoid environmental or humanitarian catastrophe, publicize the outcome clearly, is the kind of enforcement that builds long-term credibility. Shipping companies and insurers can actually plan around rules that are consistently applied. Iran's approach, laying mines in contested waters and then trying to spin an accidental tanker fire into a deterrent success story, is the kind of enforcement that destroys credibility, both with the international shipping industry and, more importantly for Tehran, with its own population, who are being told a very different story about who controls that waterway than what the ship tracking data and Iran's own Revolutionary Guard statements actually show. And that's really the core tension worth watching going forward. Iran needs the Strait of Hormuz to be seen as something it controls, because that control is one of its last remaining pieces of real leverage in this entire conflict. But every mine that goes off, every tanker that catches fire, every U-turn captured on ship tracking data, chips away at that narrative just as surely as the blockade itself chips away at the actual oil revenue. The regime is losing the economic fight and the narrative fight simultaneously, and those two things are deeply connected, because a regime that can't credibly claim to control its own coastline has a much harder time convincing anyone, foreign governments or its own citizens, that it's negotiating from a position of strength. So where does this go from here? There are really 2 paths worth watching, and they pull in opposite directions. On one path, the blockade holds, continues tightening the way it has consistently since July 14th, and the daily drip of redirected vessels keeps compounding into a genuinely serious economic crisis for a regime that has already admitted, through its own chief negotiator, that it couldn't move a single barrel of oil during the earlier round of this exact same pressure. That's the path where economic exhaustion, not a single dramatic military event, becomes the thing that eventually forces a real negotiation on terms Washington rather than Tehran gets to shape. On the other path, Iran doubles down on the mining and harassment strategy we've already seen play out around the Omani Route, betting that enough chaos and ambiguity in the strait will eventually make the economic cost of enforcing the blockade too high for the United States and its partners to sustain indefinitely. That's a real possibility too, and it's worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Sustained naval operations are expensive, they require constant rotation of assets, and there's always a domestic political question of how long any administration is willing to keep committing resources to an open-ended maritime enforcement mission. But based on everything we've seen so far, the disciplined rules of engagement, the humanitarian carve-outs, the consistent and escalating numbers being published every few days, there's no visible sign right now that this campaign is losing momentum or running into that kind of fatigue. Either way, I think the more important lesson from this specific story is one about how modern conflicts actually get decided. It's tempting to measure a war purely by the explosions, by the strike footage, by the dramatic single nights that make for great video content. But wars this asymmetric, a global superpower against a regional power that's already economically strained, often get decided just as much by the boring numbers as by the loud ones. 9 redirected, 1 disabled, 0 barrels exported during the last enforcement window, according to Iran's own negotiator. Those numbers don't trend the way a fireball does, but they may end up mattering more to how this entire conflict actually resolves. Explosions get the views. Spreadsheets sometimes win the wars. And what do you think happens next? Do you think Iran manages to find a workaround that keeps meaningful oil revenue flowing despite the blockade, whether through the northern route, through third-party intermediaries, or through some other mechanism we haven't fully seen yet? Or do you think this economic pressure ends up being the thing that forces a genuine negotiated outcome faster than any strike campaign could on its own? I'm also curious what you make of the contrast between how each side is handling the information side of this, CENTCOM publishing a clean, incrementing number every few days, versus Iran's own Revolutionary Guard accidentally admitting to a mined shipping route while trying to spin it as a win. Let me know what you think in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'm always curious how you're reading the economic side of this compared to the military side. If you found this breakdown useful, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next update the moment new numbers come out of CENTCOM. Because this is a story that's genuinely moving day by day right now. Thanks so much for watching, everybody. I'll see you in the next one.